welcome to this session of the Gwir Fwyd a Ffermio conference for Real Food and Farming Conference for the Sustainable Farming Trust. And my name is Aled Jones. I'm a dairy farmer and Deputy President of NFU Cymru, and I'll be chairing this session this afternoon on measuring sustainability. Now, I wonder, you probably just like myself, the number of times that you mentioned the word sustainable or sustainability has probably increased tenfold in the last few years, and it's only rightly so, I'm afraid. And but it's really important, I stress this, it's important that we understand what sustainability means. And of course, in this session, we will be focusing on measuring sustainability. Now, back in 1987, the United Nations defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And that really is about responsibility, isn't it? Being accountable to future generations. And sustainability, as the UN mentions, must encompass the environment, yes, economical, yes, social and cultural. So that's the setting the scene. We have hopefully we'll have three speakers with us this afternoon. I will introduce them to you. They're Nestl Jones, who's the Deputy CEO of Sustainable Food Trust. We have Robert Craig, a dairy farmer and farmer director of First Milk, a farmer-owned cooperative. And we are awaiting for Julian Bell, who is a principal consultant for Agricult at the SEC Consulting. Julian is on his way in, and hopefully he won't be too long. Now, I'll be asking the speakers to address the audience for not more than 10 minutes, and hopefully that will give us enough time then for a panel questions and answers. And like before, of course, you can pose the questions that you might have to the speakers on the chat function. So without much ado, we'll go straight to Nestl Jones, the Deputy CEO of Sustainable Food Trust. Nestl, she has been with the Sustainable Farming Trust since 2013, primarily focusing on projects including true cost accounting in food and farming and the harmonisation of farm-level sustainability assessment. In 2020, Nestl undertook a part-time secondment to the Welsh Government, working on an annual sustainability assessment for Welsh farmers called the Farmer Sustainability Review. Now, between 2018 and 19, she undertook a part-time secondment with DEFRA, working on a project called Gold Standard Metric, which aimed at harmonising government-led farm supply chain sustainability metrics. So Nestl is perfectly accompanied for this role, and I'm sure we'll be interested to hear Nestl presentation to us. Over to you, Nestl, and welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Aled, and thank you to the team behind the conference today. I'm really honoured to be here speaking to you all. I apologise, I'm a little bit croaky, so just yeah, bear with me if I have a minor coughing fit halfway through, but hopefully not. As Aled said, my name's Nestl. I'm Deputy Chief Executive of the Sustainable Food Trust, and one of my big areas of work within the SFT is looking at how we measure sustainability on farms and how we can do that in a more joined up way. I think, as Aled was referring to, sustainability is becoming such a buzzword now. There's others out there as well: regenerative, agroecology, climate smart farming, whatever word you want to use. These are things we're all starting to hear more and more about now, and for good reason, as Aled said. We do have to think about how farming can transition away from perhaps being seen as somewhat part of the problem in some areas, to an industry which is totally part of the climate change, nature and health solution. And I think that's completely possible. But to do that, we have to understand where we're starting from in terms of the baseline of sustainability that we're all at the moment, and then from that understand what steps we can make over time to being better in the economic, the environmental and social aspects of sustainability. So we've been working for some time on a project we're now calling the Global Farm Metric, and Robert, who you'll hear from in a minute, has been part of that process throughout the time we've been working on it. And it really started from sitting down with a group of farmers and saying, look, what audits do you already do on your farm? And this was probably 6 going on 7 years ago now, so things have moved on quite a lot since then. But even back then, farmers were doing certification audits, carbon footprinting. It was quite kind of early back then, but it's still going on. Compliance and regulation checks and audits, BPS and stewardship applications, voluntary kind of assessments that some farmers are doing. There was a whole host of different audits that farms are already doing, and I'm sure many of you are already doing different bits of those on your farms. I know there's quite a lot of farmers in the audience here. And when we looked at those things, when we sort of mapped them all against each other, we realized that actually there's a hell of a lot of overlap between them. And from that, an opportunity to do things in a much more joined up way, so that farmers aren't having to do 5, 6, 7, 8 different audits a year, but actually potentially one integrated audit, which then sends off all the information off to all the various places that it needs to go. And the other sort of observation, I suppose, from the farmers we were working with was that some of the standard-based audits at the moment, they're very helpful in obviously helping you gain market access, organic, for example. But what they don't necessarily do is tell you if your soil health was any better than it was last year, or your water quality, or the way that your workers on your farm are doing and being trained up, and these sorts of things. So there's all sorts of what we call outcome metrics, which I think we should start measuring on farm, which are less yes or no tick box answers and more kind of hard data where possible. What is your soil organic matter compared to what it was last year? How clean is your water? How clean is your air? And trying to measure those as accurately as possible whilst keeping it practical and not too expensive. So we set about creating this global farm metric, as it's now called, and it's called the Global Farm Metric because we believe there should be a common framework for measuring on-farm sustainability, which could be used by any farmer around the world. And obviously we're a UK-based organisation, so we thought, let's start here. Let's try and develop this framework here in the UK. And this was all sort of pre-Brexit, but when Brexit happened, we realised there might be an opportunity to integrate some of this thinking into the new farming schemes in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. And so we started pulling together this what we were calling a harmonised way of measuring sustainability. So effectively taking the best bits of things that already exist, not reinventing the wheel, but thinking about what's out there at the moment and thinking about how we can pull it together into a consistent framework that really speaks to farmers in their language. So I'm just going to share a few slides to illustrate a little bit about what I'm talking about, because I think that makes it easier. So hopefully you can see this. So what is the Global Farm Metric? It's a framework that provides a whole farm perspective, drawing on the economic, social and environmental data from farms. And it's a single set of categories, indicators and metrics for measuring whole farm sustainability. And it has been entirely designed by farmers. And this is kind of what it looks like. And this has been sort of, as I said, 5, 6 years in the making. It's got 11 categories of assessment, 3 key indicators.
Sorry.
Oh, you can't see them. I
can see them. If it was full screen, it'd be easy. At the moment, we can see the main slide and 4 smaller ones.
Hang on, let me change that.
It's just on that one. There was a lot of detail. It'd be good if it was a bit bigger.
Let me see if I can do that again.
Thank you.
Is that working now?
Perfect.
Okay, yeah. Cool. Okay, so yes, this is the Global Farm Metric Framework. It's got 11 categories of assessment and 3 key indicators under each category. And we have been testing this now in all sorts of different scenarios. So for the new government schemes, as I mentioned, we are suggesting to DEFRA, Welsh Government, Scottish Government, Government in Northern Ireland, that they should introduce an annual sustainability assessment, which is not just another sustainability assessment, but is something that pulls all the existing assessments together through this common harmonised framework. So I've been working with them to help implement that idea. The Welsh Government, as you've probably already seen in their recent consultations, have already committed to introduce something called the Farm Sustainability Review, which will effectively do just this. It will measure, where possible, outcome-based data on farms to help farmers make those incremental improvements year on year. We're also working with the retailers, because obviously they're requiring more data now from farmers if their supply chains are going to become more transparent, and they're going to start thinking about future sourcing requirements for their food. We're also working with food companies like McDonald's, Arla, Nestl, etc. We're working with banks and investors, because they're starting to want to understand the impact that their farming customers are having. So we're working in partnership with NatWest very closely at the moment, but also some of the other banks as well. And they're thinking about what innovative mechanisms they can start to introduce to help their customers make those incremental steps to become more sustainable. But to do that, they need to understand where their customers are at and the journey that they're going on. And potentially, you know, we don't necessarily see this in this current form being a food label, because this is a lot of information here, but this could be, you know, aggregated up into something much more simple, which would potentially tell consumers about the impact on nature, climate, and health and well-being. So we're providing that holistic picture of what's happening on a farm, rather than just thinking about carbon or just thinking about nature, which, as we know, is just, you know, telling one story of what's happening on a farm. So when we think practically what this looks like for farmers, the model we're working towards with the global farm metric is that it's a framework that will be set, and that framework can then be integrated into lots of different pieces of software. So we don't necessarily see there being one tool for the global farm metric, but instead a framework which you can then apply in slightly different ways. But we did recognize that we needed a version of a tool to be able to test this with farmers, get feedback, test it with companies, test it with government. And so we developed this. This is what we're calling the Global Farm Metric Research Tool. And it's quite simple. It's a self-assessment for farmers. You work through each of the categories, you put the information in, and then it gives you this radar diagram or spider diagram at the end of the assessment. And this looks a bit funny because there's only 3 or 4 of the 5 of the categories are filled in, but you can get a sense of what it starts to look like once you've put the information in. You can see a snapshot of how you're doing across your whole farm in all of these areas. Obviously, there's some people who might not be able to fill in all of these categories, but mostly you can. And so if any farmers in the session want to give this a go, please let me know, and we can send it across. It's available free, open source for anyone to use. And we're doing quite a lot of trials at the moment. With DEFRA, with Red Tractor, with Tesco, Morrison's, and NatWest, and hoping to do many more going into the years to come. And basically, we this is something we, the Sustainable Food Trust, have been running for a number of years. It was quite a hard sell as an idea initially. Why would we harmonise our metrics? That doesn't seem like an important thing to do. Fast forward to where we are now. Everyone wants data from farmers, and therefore are recognising the need for a joined up framework to do things in a way which doesn't burden the farmer, but also doesn't make it complicated for everyone who needs to use that data. And so we decided to relaunch the Global Farm Metric as a coalition earlier this year. And these are some of the organisations that have been involved in these discussions as part of the coalition, which is working really actively to develop this framework. It's not finished. We're not saying it's perfect. It's in development, and we're working with all these organisations and, of course, farmers on the ground to continue to develop that. And so we'd love to have as many people involved as possible. We're running trials in the UK. We're running trials in the US, Australia, New Zealand, Africa. So really starting to kind of get a sense of what works for farmers on the ground in these different parts of the world. But I hope that's given you a snapshot, and I hope it sets up some interesting discussion at the end of the session. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Adele. Before we leave, we're coming into this conference very soon after the COP26 conference, and there were so many delegations there. And I know full well that you were represented there as well. Now, this area of harmonizing between different countries, how well is it advancing at the moment?
It's well, it's certainly something that came up a lot in pretty much every single session I went to at COP. Whether it was the chief executive of McDonald's or smallholder indigenous communities of farmers in Africa, everyone is saying, look, we need this data, but we need to make sure it doesn't just become a kind of cowboy market of loads of different frameworks, loads of different methodologies, all giving you a slightly different result. So it was really obvious that this is needed. Yeah. We're obviously not the only organization working on metrics. There's organizations like the World Benchmarking Alliance who have set a kind of global standard for food and agriculture. And there's a few others as well, the SAI platform, some of you may be aware of. I think we're probably unique in that this has been developed by farmers, and it really drops down to that kind of cellular farm level. It's not at 50,000 feet looking at a food system, but it's really focusing on what works for farms and then thinks about how that connects into the rest of the supply chain. So we're working with a number of different vehicles. There's a new initiative called Regen 10, which is effectively an acceleration platform for regenerative agriculture on a global scale. They're looking to raise sort of hundreds of millions of dollars to get this initiative off the ground, and we're hoping to be the kind of metrics arm of what they're doing. So I think that will really speed up progress. But yeah, it's certainly a hot conversation, but it's certainly quite a busy space also at the moment.
I can well imagine. Thank you, Adele. Now, I'll use the chairman's prerogative, and I will jump actually and ask Julian Bell to speak to us next. I'll keep Robert Craig until the end, a dairy farmer. Always better to keep the cream until the end, isn't it, Robert? But anyway, Julian Bell, thankfully you were able to arrive in, and thankfully that you've been able to be with us. Julian is the principal consultant at Agricult, SAC Consulting. He's passionate about helping farmers ensure their economic and environmental sustainability, and he leads the SRUC's carbon calculator service, Agricult. Now, he's responsible for partnerships, innovation, commercial and development, and he leads a team delivering farm carbon audit and mitigation plans for a range of government, levy body and agricultural supply chains. He has a wide experience in practical farm and woodland management and in providing consultancy advice in business, livestock, crop and bioenergy sector issues. He works across the UK, overseas, including agricultural development and carbon mitigation work in Russia, Ukraine, Cuba and Latin America. And I'm glad he's been able to work with us tonight. Now, he uses his experience and skills to help farmers, governments and supply chain clients understand and develop effective strategies for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions in an economically sustainable way. In his spare time, he likes cycling, hill walking, and supporting the family farm. Well, that's a very rounded individual. Now, welcome you, Julian, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Aled, and good day to everyone. Great to be invited along. So I look forward to discussions as the debate meeting develops. So I suppose my angle on the whole area is, sustainability, which Aled's obviously highlighted at the beginning, is a long-standing concept of farming, whether it's, care of the land, making sure the business is there for the next generation. And obviously a critical part of that is making sure the cash flow is there and that the farm can maintain its sort of profitability and keep the family employed, as it were. So now that, I think there have been times where that's sort of not really been reflected in, the measures or the sort of public statements about sustainability and, the environment. The environment is, the reason we want to improve the environment is obviously to make it a better place for everyone to live. And to do that, everyone has to have, make a reasonable living. So I think this all actually feeds into our approach to carbon, because we it might not look like it, but I've been working on this for 15 years. So we actually started this back in 2007, carbon footprinting, and we were actually spurred on by the New Zealanders who claims, and they continue to do so, about their land being better than ours because they, allegedly, obviously, they say they've got efficient production systems and things like that. So we started to look into that from obviously a UK perspective, and we found that they had been using not particularly relevant data for the UK and actually selling us short, probably not surprisingly. So from that point on, we said, okay, well, we really need to understand what is going on here. And I think farming as a whole is moving in that direction. Farmers are, from our experience, they're actually sort of saying, well, hang on, this is going to be a new important area. We really need to get to grips with it ourselves so that we have got more control over what happens, and we don't want things imposed on us. We want to understand what we can do, how we can benefit from it, and how we can adapt. So, and it's incredible how that whole sort of farmers' perception of this has changed in the last sort of 3 years. So Agricult, the name actually means agricultural resource use efficiency calculator. So it is all built around farming efficiently, using resources, not wasting resources, reducing carbon emissions. And the word carbon isn't actually in there because we actually went for a period where it was quite a good way of farmers not coming to a meeting if they thought it was too focused on that. Now, things have moved on quite a lot, and that's perhaps not the case now. But I thought I'd just quickly, with the short introduction, just cover one or two things. The purpose of carbon footprinting, what's driving it, and reducing emissions, what sort of things are driving it. You obviously know about the policies, the ones that we've already got. There's a lot in the pipeline. There's government targets, so clearly the government society is encouraging that. The market is looking for sustainable producers, or ones who can demonstrate that they're taking steps to cut emissions. And then there's good old-fashioned, let's see if we can look for any sort of wastes or efficiencies that we can cut, we can work on as a farming business. And a lot of our advice and support for farmers is, look, find out where you are, get an accurate figure, and if it looks, benchmark yourself, start looking at areas, and the measures you're going to focus on are those that will save cost and save time and resources on the farm. And that is wholly compatible with everything with all these things. Farming has to remain productive. It has to provide food, good quality food at a reasonable price, because wider implications of climate change and things like that are all dependent on effective food production. So in terms of the audits and things, in terms of going onto the farm, I'll just give a quick overview of that. So there is data required, and it's very interesting to hear what's being said here. You've the farmers, from the farmers' point of view, from everyone's point of view, people don't want multiple visits and multiple times spent collecting the same data. So we are aware of that. I mean, our current system obviously is dependent on data getting inputted, but over time, as much of that as possible has either got to be connected with existing data sources or other initiatives, so like the global farm metric, so that we can, the critical thing for us is, at the time, whether it's the farmer himself or whether someone's helping him, that as much time as possible is actually spent looking at the solutions, and we try and minimize the time sort of pulling data together. And farmers are very keen on our experience. They want to see where they are. They want to look, and they're extreme. That's what gets them excited. The actual data collection things it's necessary, but it's contingent on likes of ourselves and everyone working with farmers to try and get that data burden down, and to help focus on the positive areas that the farmers can benefit from. And there are, I think, also there are sort of silver bullets being sort of put around the industry in terms of new technologies or certain figures for, say, carbon capture and things like that. But what we're finding in practice is that actually it's a range of sort of smallish improvements on any individual farm can really actually start to make quite a difference. 3% reduction, say, on better use of feeds, 4% on improving calving rates and things like that, a few percent from sort of fertilizer saving. On their own, you think, okay, well, is that really worth doing? But actually, before you know it, you've sort of got 10, 15% savings. And that's where we start with most farmers, is saying, okay, well, look, what can you tweak? What can you improve? Each thing doesn't have to be massive on its own, but that, again, that'll cut your emissions. That will generally, that'll obviously only get you so far. I think what we're finding is after that first year or two, the next stage is more things like, you may have to, a bit of shift in the system. You might have to, say, move to more intent or more managed grazing. You might need to invest in more water points and things for the cattle or sheep. You might need some new equipment for precision application of fertilizer, things like that. And yeah, capital's required. Most of these things should pay for themselves. We're seeing in Scotland, and you've obviously other parts of perhaps Wales is part of it, but there are capital grants coming forward for some of that equipment. So again, that helps cover the cost of that, and they will lead to long-term savings, some of those capital improvements. And this process continues. Now, farmers are actually get to net zero, we've got to cut our emissions. It's easy to sort of look at farming and say, well, that's going to be really difficult because there's emissions from methane, nitrous oxide. But there is actually time to do it. We've got, the UK governments and Welsh and UK government, Scottish governments and other governments have set targets that there are decades or more to sort of make those improvements, and no one's actually expecting farming on its own to get to net zero, perhaps a second. So there's time to make steady progress. And at the moment we would say do the things that obviously pay for themselves. Where there's capital funding coming forward, then that's a useful thing to make use of. And then at some point the market or government will be there, or will have to be there to help support that change. But I think my sort of final point on all this is that the farmers can make the changes. The farmers have to understand what they can do, and they've got to come up with a plan. People can help them. We can help by making data more easily available. There's obviously got research and good information out there to help the farmers. But everything we do has got to put the power into the hands of the farmer, and they're increasingly keen to to do their part. So so that's just a sort of overview of the sort of the experience we're having at the moment in this area.
Yeah, thank you, Gillian. That's very, very interesting. And I'm sure this is a field, this is science, which is moving rapidly every day, isn't it? And you mentioned small things like feed efficiency and calving percentage and health parameters. They all feed in. So the importance of inputting new science must be so crucial. And how do you keep up with that developing science? Because it is a global input, isn't it?
Well, obviously the default area is to follow the IPCC, and within the UK, each country has got its national inventory, and that is evolving. Different areas that are being updated, and some of the ones at the moment relate to nitrous oxide and woodlands, but there are future things coming. Methane's obviously a key one. I mean, the central calculations that we do is to follow the UK IPCC methods standards, but we are increasingly sort of working with groups and things, saying, okay, well, potentially if other change, things evolve, how could that affect? The methane one's a key one, the GWP star. It's not official IPCC But it's good to look at that as an individual farm and say, okay, well, if that starts to come into play, how would that affect me? And again, the inhibitors on the farm, there are products there. There are not all the benefits right now are necessarily officially sanctioned, as it were, but some of them potentially will come through. So we would tend to say, look at your emissions and say, okay, well, if we can apply that technology, where does that take us? And well, methane inhibitors, beef and sheep quite similar. 50% of your official emissions would be methane. There can be potentially sort of 20% around that level reduction, and depending on whether you can supply the product into the grazing animal or not, then you're looking at potentially up to 10% reduction in overall emissions. So at a cost, of course, at the moment, but that's one example. And you've got nitrification inhibitors in fertilizer, actually pretty effective. They do have a cost. It's around about £50 per tonne of carbon saved, but actually in the scheme of things, that's not too high. But what the farmer and others are looking for is where's the incentive to take those extra steps?
Yeah, thank you. This is a very, very field of work, isn't it? And I appreciate everything that you said. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions from the participants later on. Now, I intentionally left Robert until the end. Robert, like myself, is a dairy farmer who's very accustomed to data capture on a daily basis for farm management, but also in authenticating the standards of what we produce. And that's so, so important, underpinning our credentials. Now, Robert is a partner on 2 dairy farms with a total over 1,000 cows, having grown from 80 cows in nearly 20 years. And that's phenomenal growth. He's a past county chairman of Cumbria NFU and a Nuffield scholar. And in 2012, he became the chairman of the Penrith and Border Conservative Association. And in 2013, he jointly won the Farmers Weekly Dairy Farmer of the Year award. Robert is also a trustee of the Royal Association of British Dairy Farmers and has been involved with Sustainable Food Trust in developing the global farm metric. So your views are very important, Robert, and I do look forward to your input to us this afternoon. It's over to you.
Thank you, Aled. Hope you hear me, and thank you to Adele and Julian for their presentations. Usually when I give an introduction to myself, I miss out the little bit about the Conservative Party now, because that's a huge embarrassment that I've got. But I've left that one at arm's length. What I'll do is I'll describe a little bit about our own businesses, and then I'll talk you through the journey that I've gone on, if you like, over the last sort of 6 years plus with Adele and Patrick at the Sustainable Food Trust, and then a little bit about First Milk and what we're doing with our regenerative farming, the launch of our regenerative farming program just recently. So the farms themselves, we're up to 3 dairy units now. We've got 2 in Cumbria and 1 over the border in Northumberland. We're farming just about 2,000 acres now, all pastures, all grass-based, predominantly spring-based milk production, but we do have 1 herd that's on a split block. And we're employing about 22, 23 people or thereabouts. And that is a world away from where I was certainly about 25 years ago, when we all had milk quotas and we had very few cows and no staff, and just me and my father, very much a family-based dairy farm, really. So, a steep learning curve in many respects, but certainly the people side of it has been the steepest one. My other involvement within the industry, so obviously First Milk director and vice chairman of the co-op at First Milk, members really all the way from Scotland right the way down to the southwest, and a big cluster in Pembrokeshire, of course, around the creamery. 2 main sites, one in Pembrokeshire and 1 up here in Cumbria, where we make cheddar cheese. So if you're buying cheese from Sainsbury's or Tesco own label, the likelihood is you're buying our cheese. I represent First Milk Dairy UK, and as Alice said, I'm a trustee of the Royal Association of British Dairy Farmers. But I think the the pivotal point in my life was doing an Nuffield scholarship in 2012, and I set off to travel the world really to learn about dysfunctional supply chains, and ended up writing a report much more on resource depletion and a lot around water actually, and how much food rely on irrigation and what that meant. But Jenny, that Nuffield journey, I happened to come across a guy called Patrick Holden, introduced via a meeting I actually had over in Canada, and obviously got to know Patrick then, and spent quite a bit of time since with Patrick. I had a deep interest in sustainability of our own businesses, and the home farm here where we live supplies Nestl through First Milk. And I was already doing sustainability audits with Nestl way back in the sort of 2013-14 time, and very few were doing it then. We were sort of trialing something called RISE, which is a response-inducing sustainability evaluation, which is quite a complicated process. You sit down and basically feed all your data into a program. It takes you most of a day, if not 2 days, and it sort of spits out lots of bits of information that you either do understand or probably don't understand really. And Nestl were doing this in all the major milk fields around the world, but there's just 1 or 2 doing it in this country. But that was where my sort of interest started in Nestl Milk Plan then, which was very much based around biodiversity gain, restoring dry stone hedges, planting new hedges, gapping up hedges, planting traditional woodlands and fencing off waterways. And that was the sort of Nestl Milk Plan at the time. But we were also doing carbon auditing. Old tech to do carbon auditing, but we ended up with a number that again no one really understood. It didn't really tell us anything. It was just a number. You know, how did we arrive at that? Where were the weaknesses in the system, and how had we got to that? That's another conversation about natural capital. And I remember having, you know, probably Patrick would have been the first person that sort of introduced me to the concept of natural capital and how we measured natural capital. Why would we, if you like, why would our natural capital balance sheet be any different to our capital balance sheet? Why would we measure natural capital in a different way between farms and businesses? Because it should all essentially be very much more harmonized. We should be looking and measuring things very much along the same basis. So I got involved with Patrick from meeting him during my Nuffield really, and Adele. So this was probably a good 6 years ago. Adele, at some point it changed from being a true cost accounting working group to being a farm metrics working group. And I was looking back through my emails. I'm not exactly sure when that happened, but it was probably about 6 years ago. And I repeat a lot of what Adele said here. It was very much that we were all expected to do multiple audits. We were doing things for Nestl and also Red Tractor, the other members of the group doing leaf audits and organic audits if information was in duplicate. And we were looking really at a way of simplifying this so that we didn't have to do these multiple audits. If you gather the data once and then you use it most effectively, really. And we wanted to really create something that was of a help to the actual farm, the farmer or farm land manager, something that actually helped him progress and didn't actually just give you a hurdle that you had to get over every year and you sighed a big sigh of relief. It had to be something that meant something. You could see where the weaknesses were, see where the strengths were, because of course this is very much, it's not just all negative. You know, we're doing things, you know, even the most intensive farmers are actually doing good in some ways for the environment. So it's very much a positive and a negative thing, really. Something that's simple so that farmers could really understand it. So I think what we did initially, one of the first things we did was look what already out there. I mean, I'd done a little bit of this already, but we looked and we sort of did a gap analysis of the tools that already existed and see where their failings were, really, where their problems might be, where they didn't really make sense. And then we sort of built our matrix, if you like, on top of that. And it's just amazing. I mean, the speed, so recently, we did work sort of 4 or 5 years and it felt like we were refining what we had all the time. But certainly since it became a much more of a collaborative approach, and we got all the various partners involved, it's really, and obviously with the leadership of Adele, it's amazing where it's going at the moment. It's just incredible. Everybody seems to know about it all of a sudden, which is great. And we certainly said sort of halfway through the project, if we could get DEFRA to pick up on this and actually pick it up in terms of government using it to something that would either drive policy or could deliver support back to farms post CAP, that would be a great win. And of course, we've well into the test and trials project with DEFRA now, as Adele alluded to. And I mean, that would have been a dream right back at the beginning. It's amazing, you know, that we actually got involved. The real beauty of this whole project is, it's like Adele said, it was developed by farmers. It was, you know, we were the sense test. It didn't understand it, didn't know principles, methodology for each of the indicators. Then it didn't go any further. So it had to be something that we all understood, and it's a real sort of an improvement tool as we go through. I'll just talk a little bit about First Milk, and this is again the speed at which this has moved on. I remember speaking to various members of the board at First Milk 3 or 4 years ago around sort of principles of regenerative farming and the work that I was involved with the Sustainable Food Trust and Adele and Patrick. And I wouldn't say it was for feet, but I don't think that the audience was ready for it. And then as we are today, as First Milk, we've launched our regenerative farming program, and we actually start paying an incentive to all of our members, those that get involved in any case, from April next year. And I mean, it's a slow, it's not incentive to start with, but to get this payment, they've got to have a regenerative farming plan in place, and then we'll audit it. The membership team will audit that as we go on. A step further on is the Nestl work now that we've just launched again, the Nestl Milk Plan, which is very much based around soil carbon now. There are still elements of biodiversity and the past work that we've done, but it's upwards of about 10% of the milk price now, the Nestl premium, as we go forward, and there's a lesser or greater extent that each member of our members can get involved, and it's quite ambitious, and I think it will be maybe too fast for some of our members, but it's very much, I mean, it's not heading towards organic, but it's certainly talking much more about multi-species swards, rotational grazing, a lot less nitrogen fertilizer, you know, the really efficient use of our own nutrients, so low emission spreading, you know, very much a lot of the stuff that's actually coming down the path towards us in terms of slurry storage and lids on slurry stores and all this sort of stuff, renewable energy. It's basically the more points you can gain, the bigger the extra payment you get for your milk through Nestl. So, and that's the direction of travel. The Nestl Milk Plan tends to lead the rest of the First Milk member pool, if you like. So I would have thought within 5 years, pretty much the whole membership will be pretty much on the same page there. I don't know how long I've spoken for, Chairman, but I've probably spoken enough. I'm looking forward to questions.
I think we'll leave some time for questions. If I can have the first one, Robert. You pressed on the issue of collecting data, and farmers are obviously accustomed to collecting data for auditing process, and some of that can be, well, let's say sour and dour, isn't it? It's a chore that people look upon. Now then, if the understanding is there, and as you've highlighted, you know why, what it leads to, and the advantages of doing so, then it becomes sweet and pleasurable. What's the challenge there, and how do we do that? Interact that vision people.
I think in my mind we've had the challenge of sort of making the business case for change, and I think that was the frustration. Like all the way through my Nuffield, I could see that there were real misgivings in the way that we're farming. Further intensification, economics were driving us down a path that isn't good for anybody. It's good for the day, but it's not long-term sustainable. So it's around, if you're going to convince people to go on the journey, very often you've got to make the economic case, you've got to make the business case for change. And if, as we are now, certainly with the Nestl group and beginning to do with our member group, once there's a financial incentive in there for people to do stuff, for people to go out with a spade, dig holes and count worms and look at soil structure and all these sorts of things that basically they wouldn't have seen as being advantageous in the past. Once you start to make the case, I think farmers are up for it. They're definitely up for it once they understand it. But it's about economics, and I think we ignore the economics at our peril, because it's economics that will drive change across every sector of every industry.
Yeah, thank you. Now, I think there's an invitation for the audience participants to answer questions. So please bring your questions forward into the chat function, because this is the opportunity that we have. And just whilst you might be printing, I would just like to throw this one in as being very current. Obviously, we are looking into negotiating trade negotiations across the world. Other countries are likewise looking for our market. What is the challenge here, and what's the urgency that we should be, obviously in making sure that our credentials on sustainability are sound? Because I'd hate in 20 years' time to be found out that our sustainability credentials were not up to it.
Well, I can comment on that. I think there's actually an amazing opportunity with trade, and I think the mess, you could call it, that we've just been through with the Australian trade deal and all the backlash that received about products potentially coming in and undercutting our producers in this country. I think it's been really sad to witness that happening. And I think that I think there's a massive opportunity for governments around the world to show leadership by setting trade deals based on sustainability standards across the world, and therefore being able to trade products based on those common standards, rather than having these conversations about different standards around the world, and therefore putting different farmers in different countries and scenarios at a disadvantage. But I do think, as you say, Aled, that means that we have to stand behind what we say our standards are. And I think we have to start collecting data so that we can be really rigorous in saying that our farmers are, very carbon friendly, are very animal welfare friendly. Because at the moment, I think it's all a little bit woolly, to be honest. So I think there's a huge opportunity to use this data for a whole host of things. But I think future trade deals, one where it could actually really help our farmers access new markets, but based on these common set of metrics and data.
Yeah. Else want to mention a comment? No. If not, there's a question by Stephen Jacobs. How do we take into account the time? Retail buyers are motivated almost entirely by short-term goals. Of course, we know sustainability is measured over the long term. How do we or they square that circle? Who's going to venture? Perhaps I'll ask Julian.
Sorry.
Well, this is a very difficult one. Even for the farming, profit maximization in the short term is very hard to get out of, purely because you've got bills to pay and all the rest of it. So now, again, this is where longer term contracts give the security to invest and develop long-term solutions. Now, that is quite a mixed picture, clearly, with the retail sector. So in terms of farming, where's that stability come from? A lot of it is, well, farming businesses, I don't think a lot of the retail sector, I don't think you can rely on them necessarily to come out with that longer term strategy, and it's down to the individual farm businesses. And Craig has obviously mentioned some of those things that they've done, but that's what we find with farm business. If you just look, you've got to look further ahead. I've done a lot of work with different businesses, even on the financial side. The better farmers are the ones who they tend to have a more consistent and higher income. It's not the very best every year, it's not the lowest, but they take various steps to protect themselves each year. And I think it's the same, whether it's sustainability is the same. You've just got to invest in the longer term. You wouldn't forgo profit at times, but the resilience, it will be in the longer term.
Yeah, could I come in, bring in Robert on this and put his first milk hat on, and obviously, on the commercial side of the business. Comments from you, Robert?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, actually, because if we didn't have a really solid long-term agreement with Nestl, we couldn't do any of this at all. So, and I think things are changing. It really is. This is very current. Every single one of our main customers would be talking to us. They'll be asked basically around sustainability. So then there's a two-way discussion, isn't there? You know, what do you want us to do? We can do it, but then we need a good long-term relationship, and we need to extract value for what we're doing as well, because we're asking farmers to do various things that potentially make them less viable. And the same answer goes to your question about trade as well. Politics is too short term, really, for long-term trade deals. I mean, why on earth would we be encouraging food from about as far away in the world as it is possible to bring food from, when we can produce food in the British Isles, you know, as pretty well sustainable as anywhere else, as can New Zealand, as can Australia, but neither should be gearing up to feed each other. It should be that we're gearing up to feed the parts of the world that can't feed themselves, but doing it so in a sustainable manner.
Yeah, I think certainly we need a food policy which strikes, you know, over many governments, really, rather than just for the, you know, for the period or duration of a government. And that food policy certainly has to be central within it. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, mentioned on the other day that we need a food policy that has, you know, food centrally within it in our policy, and safeguard, you know, that the poorest in our societies are able to have food safe and affordable to them. Now, there is another question here. How are carbon offsets accounted for? Especially in Wales, obviously we have a tree growing target here, specifically on the recommendations of the IPCC. If the trees on your farm are being paid for in an offsetting scheme, right, do you ensure they are not double accounted and included in the farm's own sustainability report? That's a very hot topic, isn't it? Who would want to go on that one? Julian.
Yes, I mean, their standards are absolutely critical for all these things, and there's relatively similar issues with soil carbon as well. You know, there has to be, I mean, the Woodland Code have done a good job in terms of, we've got a register of woodlands that have created credits. They've followed a methodology, and if someone has purchased those credits, then it's clearly there on the registry. So, you know, that was a huge amount of work gone into that, and that's pretty well in terms of woodland carbon credits. So, yeah, if they are sold to someone else, then farm business, you know, that's not something the farm business can use for their own purposes. But equally, that's a voluntary market. So in the end, it's the government's inventory, and how they view woodlands on farm is going to be important. And I know there's been a lot of debate about that. You know, what can farming as an industry do or take credit for, as it were, from woodlands? You know, we're working on at the moment. There are a wider range of woodlands that do have a sort of cultural value accounted for on the farm, but then there are other woodlands that are perhaps more for longer term sort of timber production and things. So, you know, and where woodlands into farming, then clearly, if, you know, perhaps maybe more woodlands, then that can be included in the account. But yeah, you need a registry. You need to be clear who's claiming what, because otherwise the claims won't stand.
It's a very hot topic here in Wales. Of course, obviously, there's the potential for companies offsetting their carbon and using Welsh land, Welsh trees in order to do so. But obviously, we are concentrated on food production here and the implications have, unfortunately. As you probably know, we produced a report, Growing Together, at the NFU, and that's really on integrating food production with tree growing ambition, and certainly, you know, getting the adoption or the appreciation that everybody can do their part is very important. And this issue of tree hedge that we are so blessed with here in Wales is something that's, you know, is quite beneficial for us. Now, it's a comment here, a concern about multiple stakeholders throughout food system about true cost accounting. This is probably for Adele, and the difficulty of accurate assessment and multiple changing metrics that confuse consumers, e.g. retroactivized VCA. Similarly, would the global farm metric supersede all these other assessments? would you go about educating others throughout the food system about the global farm metrics benefits? That's purely for you, Adele.
Yeah, really good question, and really the first point that the question raised is case in point. Really, we need these common metrics so that we can hopefully alleviate some of the confusion, both for farmers who are having to collect all this data and then make decisions based on it, but also all the people who can then use the data down the supply chain, ultimately ending with the citizen who is then buying that food and using the power of their shopping basket to vote for the type of farming they would like to support. And to be able to do that, they need more consistent information. At the second point of the question, should this supersede all the existing standards? I think the answer is no. We're not trying to create a new certification scheme here. I think there's a clarification to make in that we're not creating a standard with the global farm metric. We are developing a framework of assessments that any farmer can kind of measure themselves on at any point in their journey and be able to kind of make steps each year to being slightly better. So we're not saying you have to be this or you have to be that. It's literally just a framework of measurement. And so in that sense, I think it's not replacing the standards, because I still think we need them to be able to access markets, make sure farmers are reaching compliance regulations and these sorts of things, and for consumers also who trust these brands like organic to be able to differentiate really easily which ones they want to buy. But I think what we can do is much like the sugar, fat, salt, I think you see food product, which is alongside other labels on health. I think have that consistency across all products. It doesn't matter whether you're in Tesco, Sainsbury's, Walmart in the States or Woolworths in Australia. You can see that consistency of reporting. But no, I don't think it will replace the current standards. Our hope is that the certification schemes could become verifiers of the global farm metric data, because they're the ones who are already out on farm. So if farmers are doing self-assessments, then the certification auditors can then go and sort of check, basically. So if we can, we're working with the likes of Red Tractor to sort of understand how the global farm metric could be integrated into their existing auditing approach, rather than creating a whole new certification scheme that needs lots of auditors. So that's the direction of travel we're hoping to go in.
We're slowly running out of time, and if I don't mind, I'll have the last question and just bring it back to this issue we started off on measuring sustainability. Now, I've publicly applauded Welsh Government in proceeding cautiously in developing a sustainable farming scheme here in Wales, because we have such a lot of learning to undertake before we proceed. And I think if we can collect this information, this data, that'll underpin our credentials, it will be so strong. Now, we have fortunate really that RPW, Payments Wales, have been very, very good in collecting information and data on farms throughout Wales and assimilating that data. How do you propose now, and I'm speaking to probably Adele and Craig here, in the input that we have to develop the sustainable farming scheme here in Wales, so that we have mass participation of farmers willing and wanting to be involved in the sustainable farming scheme and being brought into the development of a brand Wales approach?
I think there's a huge opportunity for the sustainable farming scheme to be kind of world leading, actually, helping all journey. And I think the balance the team are trying to strike in Welsh Government at the moment is creating something which is totally inclusive, so that you can enter it at whatever point you're at. You don't have to be a certain standard to be able to enter the scheme, but then understanding what that journey looks like. And we're not talking sort of 4-year cycles, we're talking the next sort of 30, 40 years of agriculture. And I think recognizing that it will take time to get there. I think that the really beneficial element of adding in the sustainable farming review, which the Welsh Government have committed to do, which will be collecting this outcome data in a consistent way, is that it will provide Welsh Government, RPW, Natural Resources Wales with this real, gritty understanding of where Welsh farmers are. And I think that's the thing we're missing a little bit at the moment, is that knowledge of really how we're all performing across these different categories and indicators. And so I think, and also it will mean eventually further down the line, Welsh Government could start paying for outcomes rather than for practices. I think to start with, the scheme will be based on a practice-based payment. So, for example, things like cover cropping, this will be based on what you can do in terms of practices. But I think once we start to build up this data set and understand where farmers are going and how they can take incremental steps, governments will start to be able to pay for things like soil carbon, subsidies on farms, these sorts of things. And I think that's where change will really start to happen more quickly. But it's a long journey, and I think having Welsh Government and now a bit in Scottish Government, I'm very much in favour of what the Welsh Government are doing. I think it's a really brilliant scheme.
I'm pleased to hear. Robert, just a finishing comment.
Yeah, no, I think Adele covered it there, really. It becomes really powerful once you can link support payments to this, practical outcomes. In a way, the Nestl work that we're doing is paying for intervention. So the question there around carbon credits, we're very careful as a business that we're not committing anything carbon-wise to one of our customers. It's very much about interventions at this stage, because we don't know how to measure the outcomes accurately and consistently, which is we've been working on this whole project for so long, and it could potentially be a fantastic market tool as well for farmers, so that you can compare yourself with your peers, with your own zone, when you can link it to either industry that will support the direction of travel or government to support the direction of travel. That's when it becomes a really powerful.
Oh, good. I've just been told you've been given an extra 10 minutes. So obviously by popular demand, and obviously I think there's quite a number of interests. Julian, there's a question regarding methane inhibitors in the chat. And obviously it's something that was brought up at COP. Quite a number of research establishments are advocating the natural means of inhibiting methane. And the implications for us, of course, in the ruminant agriculture side here in this country, and the impacts that might have. But there again, you mentioned the IPCC do not adopt the GWP star approach. Perhaps you might be able to explain what GWP star stands for those participating today.
Okay, so I think, well, methane, like all the other emissions, you really want a holistic approach to work to sort of bring them down. So improving productivity of the herd and all those other things is obviously one. The diet is then, when you start looking at the diet, then higher quality grass, high sugar grasses. Obviously, that's a key thing with Aberystwyth and things like that. You've got a lot of history there of improving the quality, the energy of the grass, the silage management. These all can actually help reduce methane by providing the animal with a higher energy, lower sort of fiber diet. So that gets you to a certain point. The next stage, now there is work going on in this. There is some indication that certain pasture species, clovers with tannins and things like that, they can actually be pretty important and can actually help reduce methane of the animal. So yeah, we would certainly advocate all those management and natural type of grazing management practices, and even different multi-species mixes can all actually work towards reducing methane. There is more work to be done, I think, on the multi-species swards and some of the species there, but there does seem some evidence that can definitely make a difference. And the products, inhibitors, that might be your sort of last step that you might take. Appreciate that might not, depending on your farming system, that might not be suitable, but there's clearly, whether that magic solution can actually be proven to be widespread across a lot of sectors of cattle and sheep farming still remains to be seen. But the process, and then going back to the key issue with methane is that it doesn't persist in the atmosphere. It's actually it's a very strong greenhouse warming gas, but it doesn't persist. So usually within sort of 12 years, the levels have really dropped and it's being converted back into CO2, which is a much, much lower emission greenhouse warming. And the most crucial thing is that if you think of, say, you think back 20 years, if in a farming context, if you burn diesel to cultivate soils or whatever, most of those emissions are still in the atmosphere. Whereas your cattle herd back then, all those methane emissions have gone because they've been broken back down. So in the short term, maintaining the same methane output will mean that the same global warming effect is there. But even a sort of relatively slow decline in methane emissions, which we have seen, Wales has seen, you've seen fewer sheep, for instance, more concentration, smaller number of animals. As a nation, seeing a much reduced warming or even a cooling effect from the falling levels of methane from animals. I think the practical issues that, because we've been working with Oxford on some of this, trying to see how can we apply it, is that individual farms may have expanded, so their own footprint may actually have gone up, but then they are likely to be more efficient. I mean, that's obviously typical with dairy, fewer farmers. So it's a huge area, and I think there is potential to have a more fair is one word, I suppose, a more sort of balanced view of how methane is portrayed. But there are quite a few questions that sort of still need to be kind of answered to change, and that is being reviewed by the IPCC. So there may be a change in that.
Yeah, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that just in case we concentrate on methane, the implications of animal health is crucial. There's a biological waste if an animal leaves the system before it's actually finished its good biological life. Now, just imagine if we could extend an extra year in the breeding life of a sheep or a cow, and the implications that has on the cost of carbon to our system is enormous. So it is a holistic approach. Farmers hopefully would understand that getting involved in schemes really to eradicate, identify where problems lie on their particular farm, and then adopt interventions specific to their farm. And that's where, collecting of data, making sure that we target the interventions as and where it's required is so crucial. And I think, as you develop these matrices, that's the way that we actually get the biggest gain, quickest gain as well, in developing, the credentials that we have. Now, I don't think I've got any further questions today. Just really thank you very much for the speakers, Julian Bell, Adele Jones, and Robert Craig. I found it myself very beneficial listening today. I wish you well, because this is so important to us as a country. We must lead the world. I think Boris Johnson has said several times, we need to be a global leader. Well, in fact, people like yourselves will be the global leaders, and it'll be ourselves who will be adopting these principles that will make the difference. So I wish you well, and thank you so much, and thank you for those who've been as part of the audience here today as well, and wish you further as well in the rest of the meetings. Thank you very much.